Turn on your projectors and follow me down the rabbit hole. JJ Hatter welcomes you to Analysis in Wonderland. Today's topic, Dreamchild. Happy 4th of July. It is now not only American Independence Day, but also International Alice in Wonderland Day. For it was on this day in 1862 that the story was born. And what better movie to discuss in commemoration than Dreamchild? This little-known UK-produced picture is different from all the others I've talked about before, and likely will talk about in any future videos I make. This is not an Alice in Wonderland movie, but rather a movie about Alice in Wonderland. In order to talk properly about Dreamchild and explain just what I mean, we must turn the clocks back to a time before movies even existed, and we must focus on two particular people. A man by the name of Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, and a young girl by the name of Alice Pleasance Little. I'm not here to read you a biography, so I'll try to keep things here as succinct as I possibly can, and focus as exclusively as possible only on the pertinent information related to this film. Charles Lutwidge Dodgson was a reverend and mathematics instructor working at Christ Church College in Oxford, England. During his tenure there, he became well acquainted with the college dean Henry Little and his family. Most particularly, Dodgson became a favored playmate and friend of three of the dean's daughters, Lorena, Edith, and one who deserves perhaps more attention than the rest, Alice. Dodgson frequently took the three girls on outings, performed magic tricks for them, played games with them, and occasionally photographed them, with parental permission naturally, as photography, a relatively new art and science, was actually a hobby of his for a large portion of his life. While all three girls got along splendidly with the man, Alice, the middle child of the three, seemed to be the one he considered his favorite. Among Dodgson's passions was storytelling, and the three girls constantly begged him to tell them stories of fantasy and frivolity. On July 4th, 1862, which by some accounts was a drizzly day, Dodgson and a friend of his, Robinson Duckworth, strange name, took the three on a boating trip along the River Thames, and once again the trio begged him to tell them a story. Thinking on the spot, Dodgson related a tale that captivated young Alice in particular so much, she begged him to write it down for her. And that is exactly what he did. That Christmas, he presented Alice Little with a self-illustrated, handwritten manuscript entitled Alice's Adventures Underground, which recollected and organized the story he had told them all as best as he could manage. Alice shared it with her sisters, they shared it with their parents, they shared it with their friends and family, and soon a great number of people were urging Dodgson to publish the book. Dodgson was hesitant, being something of a shy, reclusive, often considered awkward sort of man, but he plucked up courage, figuring it would at least be amusing, and decided to try his luck. He made some changes to the story, hired noted artist Sir John Tenniel to illustrate the book, then changed the title when he decided the original title, to paraphrase his own words, sounded too much like a textbook on mining. Finally, Charles Dodgson decided to give himself a pseudonym, because he feared that if people knew a reverend and math tutor had written the book, it might bias them negatively. Thus, in 1865, 3 years to the date he first told the story to the three little sisters, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll was published. Now I could finish things here, but there's still more to reveal before I can get into the film, and unfortunately, this is where things take a sour turn. No one is certain about what happened, but for whatever reason, not long after the publication of Alice, even as Lewis Carroll was rapidly becoming a household name, something changed in the relationship between Charles Lutwidge Dodgson and the Littles. A rift was formed, and Carroll was never again allowed to visit the deanery, never again allowed to see the three little sisters, never again allowed to see Alice. As if this wasn't bad enough, there are two particularly suspicious facts that must be brought up. For reasons unknown to this day, several of Dodgson's personal diaries, which were begun in the 1830s and dutifully handled daily till the 1890s, close to his death, have disappeared without a trace. The ones responsible were confirmed to be members of Carroll's own family, who purportedly either destroyed or simply hid these diaries because something in them supposedly would have caused a scandal if it had been discovered. Also, Mrs. Little, Alice's mother, tore up and burned nearly all of the letters that Dodgson wrote to the girls during their more friendly years. Needless to say, given the relationship that formed prior to this sudden parting of the ways, and the shocking nature of these facts, speculation has run wild about just what could have happened. Ironically, in trying to avoid a scandal in their own lives, Mrs. Little and Dodgson's family appear to have given modern scholars the perfect fuel to fire up scandalous rumors and myths in our own time. Over the years, Carol and Alice Little would stay somewhat connected, and Carol was later invited back to the deanery almost as a show of reconciliation to take a few final family photos, but the relationship never reached the closeness it had once had. When Carol passed away, none of the Littles even went to Dodgson's funeral. As for Alice Little, who later married and took the name Alice Hargreaves, she openly admitted that her relationship with Carol, as well as the novels he wrote, had left her with mixed emotions. Everybody identified her as the little girl who followed the White Rabbit, and one can imagine the effect that would have on a proper-born Victorian lady. As for Carol, in a letter he wrote to Alice after she married, his feelings could best be summed up with a single statement, and I quote, "I have had scores of child friends since your time, but they have been quite a different thing." So you now know at least a few things about the tragic and mysterious tale of Alice Little and Charles Dodgson, and you're probably groaning, JJ, what does all this history have to do with the blasted movie? Is it a review or a lecture? Well, now we turn our attention to a different writer, Dennis Potter. Potter was a noteworthy author of both stage and screen, creating various plays, television productions, and of course feature films. In 1965, while working for a series called The Wednesday Play, a weekly drama that presented various television plays, he wrote a drama entitled Alice. The piece was directed by Gareth Davies, and without going into too much detail, was a story focused on the relationship between Lewis Carroll and Alice Little, drawing much from the many rumors and myths surrounding said relationship. I may cover 1965's Alice another time, but for now, it's simply important to know this piece was essentially the prototype for a later piece. That later piece was Dreamchild, also written by Potter, released in 1985 on a budget of £4 million and directed by Gavin Miller. It was a critical success, garnering almost unanimous praise, but it was released as a limited art house film, marketed to very few theaters, and perhaps as a result was unable to turn in a profit, and to this day remains fairly obscure. Normally this would be the point where I'd ask if the film was worth the critical praise or not, but the truth is, I don't think it does. I know it does. This movie, dear viewers and listeners, is the pride and joy of my Wonderland collection. It is not only my favorite Alice-related motion picture, but is also quite possibly one of the best and one of my favorite movies of all time. Top 5 easily for both lists. Some of you may recall from my review of the 1933 Paramount production of Alice in Wonderland that movie was made directly in response to Alice Hargreaves' visit to America for a ceremony commemorating Lewis Carroll's centenary or centennial. Well, the story of this movie actually takes place during that very trip, as we follow a grown-up Alice, the real Alice, not the storybook character, who is 80 years old, only 2 years away from deathbed in real life. She comes to New York City and has to deal with everything you can imagine comes with it. Everyone sees her as the little girl from their storybooks. Everyone is trying to jump on the Wonderland bandwagon, with advertisements featuring her, attempts to get autographs, countless gifts, and more. And as she tries to deal with this crazy new world of Depression-era USA, the elderly, virtually senile Alice begins having vivid dreams, flashbacks, and hallucinations, not only to the times she spent with Lewis Carroll, but also of scenes and characters from the Wonderland stories. Now, to give you a brief break from all this historical gibbering, let's start this review by looking at the Wonderland characters in question who appear in the film. Long before Hallmark called on their services, the characters here are all, and yes, in this case all, the work of the Jim Henson Creature Shop. This movie was made during what I like to call the dark years of Henson. Not because they were doing badly, but because this was the time where the Jim Henson Company was exploring darker and more photorealistic avenues than things like the Muppets and Sesame Street could provide. The 80s was the decade of the Dark Crystal, Labyrinth, Return to Oz, Yoda from Star Wars, and of course the Wonderlandians in Dreamchild. The designs for these characters were a perfect example of what I like to call twisted tenniel. This is when you take the original John Tenniel illustration designs and warp them just a tad. From a distance, the characters resemble those original illustrations, which are already rather odd and at times grotesque, but then the closer you look at them, the more you see that's wrong. The concept behind this approach was very simple. If Alice has gotten old and bitter, so too must have Wonderland. The more repulsive and frightening take on the world and its characters are meant to be a direct reflection of Alice's mental state and inner insecurities. Her fears, her regrets, her doubts, her frustrations. Again, this is something we'd seen to some extent or another before, and would certainly see many times again, but this was the first film to really delve into such deep psychological issues and really get into a dark and twisted place with these characters. Things like the Tim Burton movies and the American McGee's Alice games, whether they intend it or not, owe a debt to this film which can never be repaid. While the Wonderland sequences are, unsurprisingly, the most popular part of the film, and they certainly steal the show whenever they pop up, the rest of the film is a gem as well. Coral Brown plays the elderly Alice Hargreaves, and in the makeup she wears, she is practically the spitting image of the woman seen in photographs from the time. Mrs. Hargreaves is a beautifully well-rounded character. Despite her age, she's tough as nails and carries herself with constant dignity and poise, and aside from aggravation and confusion around her surroundings, tries her hardest to keep a stiff upper lip and hold her cards to her chest. However, she does show vulnerability on occasion, most often in her private moments, when she's confronted with her visions. And considering her only company in the film is her nursemaid, Lucy, she is exceedingly lonely and feels the strain of her age frequently. Despite all her attempts to be stiff and proper, she can't hide her inner turmoil. As the film goes on and she's forced to confront her past, present, and future more and more, she learns to open up and in doing so is able to come up with some self-satisfying answers to her personal issues. While Brown's performance is simply marvelous, and she well deserved the award for Best Actress from the Evening Standard, which this film brought her, of equal if not greater interest to me is young Amelia Shankly, who not only plays a young Alice Little, but also the storybook Alice in the Wonderland scenes. As the young Alice Little, she is precocious and impish and wonderfully careless. She's not a bad kid, mind you, but she is, well, a kid. She doesn't always understand or even care about what the adults around her tell her or even do for her. She tries to be nice, and she does care about people, and when she goes too far, she readily owns up to it. But like any child, or indeed any person, she is not without faults. As the storybook Alice, she's very similar, but there are very subtle, nuanced differences in her performance. It's a bit more deliberately theatrical, if that makes sense, but still sincere and interesting at the same time. She looks more or less the same, but her acting's a bit off. I would have loved to see her play Alice in a more conventional take on the story, but I guess it was never meant to be. Ian Holm plays Lewis Carroll himself in the flashback scenes. While it has always bugged me that Holm admittedly doesn't really look like the real Charles Dodgson, I mean, not even a little bit, his actual performance in the role is simply spot on. The movie toys with the myths and rumors that have long surrounded his relationship with Alice Little, but it does so in a teasingly ambiguous way. There are no clear answers as to how he truly feels or what his intentions are. For some people, this causes him to come across very unnervingly, and I can sort of see it. But for me, I think the film treats him with a sort of tenderness that other interpretations and explorations of the man in this bittersweet story tend to lack. There are no accusations here, only suspicions. And the man is so gentle and lovable and caring, it's hard to ever feel frightened by him, in my opinion. Bottom line, the movie neither demonizes nor romanticizes him. It simply tries to present him for who he might have been. Jane Asher, meanwhile, plays Alice's mother, Mrs. Little. She too is depicted faithfully and carefully. The real Mrs. Little was often said to be extremely strict to the point of near cruelty, and of course her actions following the separation and what part she could have played in it can be interpreted several ways. The film does make it clear that Mrs. Little is stern, but she's also respectful and civil, and clearly loves her daughters dearly. Once again, it's neither a vilification nor an idealization. It works very well. The cinematography in this movie is phenomenal, provided you see it the way it was meant to be seen. There are some shoddy copies of it online that really deaden the impact of the picture when compared to seeing it in its truest, highest picture and sound quality. Everything glows and the periods are represented well. The music is actually relatively scarce in this film, but when it appears, it works absolutely brilliantly, able to be suspenseful, sentimental, and everything in between. The story and the issues it deals with are very well handled. Along with Alice's personal issues of morality, uncertainty, and regret, a major theme of the story comes from the reason the real Alice's visit causes such a stir. Underneath all of the hubbub of the city and the marketeers itching for some cash, it all comes from a simple place, and I think it speaks to why so many love this story to begin with. Escapism. Think about it, it's the Great Depression. Everyone wants to get away from their strife and turmoil and go back to a time that was simpler, and a place where there are no such trials. Alice and Wonderland represent that to a T, on several levels. Innocence and escape are major parts of this story, just as much as terror and isolation. It's a beautiful, heart-turning blend. If I have one gripe about the movie, and it is a very small gripe, it comes in the form of two characters, Nicola Cowper as Lucy and Peter Gallagher as Jack Dolan, a reporter who basically becomes Alice's guide through New York and who ends up falling in love with Lucy. Both do a great job in terms of their individual performances, and some parallels between Lucy's relationship with Jack and Lucy's insecurities and troubles are brought up to Alice's own life and everything that comes with it. However, the relationship itself feels a little cliched. Jack is a knave, and I refuse to believe that pun was unintentional, who sleeps around, is always looking for a quick buck, and at first just tries to use Lucy as a means to an end, but ultimately has a change of heart. Lucy is a shy and timid lost girl who doesn't know what she's getting into at times, and of course the two have a falling out, but it's patched up quickly and blah blah blah. Maybe I'm just cynical, but the love story, in my opinion, is the weakest part of the film. It's also interesting because in real life, Alice Hargreaves visited America accompanied by her son Caril, not Carol, but Caril, who not only was purportedly estranged from her, but also a noted communist activist. Imagine if that had been kept in the film. But I suppose some Hollywood appeal was needed, and the two don't really bug me too much. The relationship may be one we've seen before, but it's still handled well, and the two are very likable characters. As a result, it hardly hurts the production. So we come to the conclusion. Before I give the rating, I just want to say that I will be doing more of these videos in the future. They just won't be released on any specific schedule anymore, and I also can't say how many more I'll make yet exactly. But rest assured, I'm not done discussing Wonderland and all its reinterpretations yet. That said, rating 10 out of 10. While the love story is predictable and old-fashioned, it at least has some thematic elements that fit the rest of the story, and neither Jack nor Lucy are bad characters. As for the rest of the film, in my opinion, it's a bloody masterpiece. There are not enough good things I could say about this film, not enough I could say about it in general. I could write a book on how much I love it, and if you're a fan of the Alice stories, you owe it to yourself to look it up one way or the other. If you aren't a fan, look it up anyway. This film is both chilling and heartwarming, fantastical yet down-to-earth, poignant yet never preachy. Unless you're just not into this sort of stuff, so to speak, there's literally no reason not to see this film. So go watch it. Top 6 performances and characters. The Caterpillar, puppeteered by Steve Whitmire and voiced by Frank Middlemass. I love the way this freaky thing is designed, with an unsettlingly human face, and a blue coloration that seems to be more due to breathing troubles than natural pigmentation. Middlemass is absolutely perfect as the voice artist. While the Disney version is the definitive Caterpillar, this one is my actual favorite. The Mock Turtle and the Griffin. The former is puppeteered once again by Steve Whitmire and voiced by Alan Bennett. The latter is puppeteered by Ron Muick and voiced by Fulton McKay. These are the only two to get more than one scene in the film, first appearing in the opening of the picture and then the closing. I would love to place them both higher, but their scenes are the shortest of the Wonderland characters. It would have been nice to see more of them. The Mad Hatter, puppeteered by Big Mick Walter and voiced by Tony Haygarth, who incidentally played Renfield in the Frank Langella starring Dracula film a few years earlier. Perfect typecasting, this. Anyway, I was going to give credit to the whole Tea Party, but the Hatter really is the one who stands out the most. The puppet and the performance overall are meant to be a stark realization of extreme mercury poisoning. And if you know anything about that and its connection to the Mad Hatter, you might guess why I like this one so much. The Mad Tea Party scene is the longest of the Wonderland hallucinations and undoubtedly my favorite sequence in the film, moving in and out from reality to fantasy to flashbacks over and over again. It's easily the best part of the whole picture. Ian Holm as Lewis Carroll. While again, the fact Holm looks nothing like the real Lewis Carroll does bother me a bit, the actual performance is simply stunning. This is easily Holmes' finest piece of work, and in my opinion, the best portrayal, out of admittedly not too many, of the man we've seen on screen to date. The character and the man he is based on are treated with care and detail, and the result is just wonderful. Cole Brown as Alice Hargreaves. As our main character, obviously this is a winning performance, and Brown manages every facet of the old Alice's personality and story arc absolutely spectacularly. There's nothing else here to say that I haven't said already. And Amelia Shankly as Alice Little and Alice of Wonderland. Shankly has to play Alice as a child, Alice as a teenager, and Alice as a fictional character throughout the movie, and with very little difference between her appearance and overall portrayal throughout, she handles each of these three sides perfectly. I have not been impressed with a performance like this in a long time, and it's a pity to me to find out Shankly did not do that many movies before or after Dreamchild. I would have thought a full career was set out for her. Who knows what other wonders await you down the rabbit hole? Join me next time and find out. This is JJ Hatter, and never forget, they're all mad here.